a ton more excited about this stuff than I am. Okay, so we're going to talk about research. And when we talk about research, social psychology really does a lot of research. And this is one of the reasons why I want you to go into the social psychology website and help people with their research. This is a really good way to do it. We're going to talk about the internet and how it has increased the amount of research being done, not just in social psychology, but in all of psychology. Purists like Dr. Kine and Dr. Wolf probably really don't like the idea that anybody, and of course you never know who anybody is, so you really don't have any way of determining whether this information is an outlier or what. But they're getting millions of people responding to their research, and that's really kind of exciting if you think about it. So this is social psychology. Social psychology is easy to do research on because there's a lot of social aspects to why people do things, and it's really important that we do as much research as possible. Research in social psychology follows the scientific method. The first thing you do is you find a phenomenon. We're going to talk about a phenomenon. Then you read everything that you can find on it, because you don't know what research has been done on that already anyway. So you need to figure out whether there's a lot of information about it. When I did my research, and of course I've only done it once, but when I did my research, I was looking at resilience among American Indians. That was my idea, and I only used one select group. So my research isn't really generalizable to the rest of the indigenous populations in the Americas, certainly not. But as a social psychologist, we use a scientific method. We come up with an idea, and then we gather information about that idea. Then we do the research, and then we analyze the information that we have, and then we interpret the information. That's a scientific method. Scientific method is really kind of tough if you think about it, because the scientific method tells you that you have to look at your point of you have to look at your point of view as if it's not the only point of view. And brilliant people have brilliant ideas, but they don't like to look at other people's ideas. They think their ideas are the best ideas because they came up with them. It's not a bad way to think, of course. You don't want to think that, geez, I'm having thoughts, but I'm sure they're stupid. You know, people don't really think like that. They think that their ideas are the best ideas. That's what politics is all about. In the last election, we asked ourselves, well, who do we want for president of the United States? And the vast majority of people in the United States said, I think Hillary Clinton would make a better president. But it didn't work out that way. She had 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, but he won because of the Electoral College. Not really important. What's my idea? So we're talking about people having ideas and whether the ideas are any good or not. So there's a lot of controversy as to whether ideas are good or not. The social psychologist first will observe a phenomenon. And of course, I was trying to think of a phenomenon we could talk about in class, and what I came up with was teenage pregnancy. Not just teenage pregnancy, but teenage pregnancy on the reservation. Let's talk about teenage pregnancy on the reservation. Is that a problem? Teenage pregnancy used to be a problem all over the United States. Potentially it was a problem on the reservation as well. And it may continue to be a problem. So the first thing that we do when we decide, we're going to talk about teenage pregnancy, the first thing that we need to do, we need to find out who has done research in teenage pregnancy up to this point. So we will come up with keywords to research teenage pregnancy. So what keywords could we possibly use? We have those two wonderful new databases in the library, PsycArticles and PsycInfo. And I sent you a letter as to how to get to them, or I sent you instructions as to how to find PsycArticles and PsycInfo. So what keywords could we possibly use? We're looking at teen pregnancy. So what keywords could we possibly use?
Age.
I'm sorry?
Age?
Age? Well, if we type age into psych articles, what are we going to get? A lot.
A lot, exactly.
So we need to be specific. We don't want 23,000 articles to read. We just want
Yeah,
the ones that deal specifically
probably
with our part.
specifically between, I would say, I don't know, maybe 13 and 17, 13 and 18?
Okay, so, well, so we need to type something in there.
Yeah.
And actually, we can put 3 things in there if we want. There's a way to do it, and I know how to do it. But, so you need to type something in there to find the articles that you're looking for. So what are we going to type in there? Age isn't bad, but we could probably type in there teen and get what you're looking for, right? We could also probably type in there teen pregnancy and get what we're looking for. So we'll put in there teen pregnancy on one line. On the second line, we can put something else. Indigenous. Or we could put Indian. It works. Indian works. We don't have to put American Indian. All we have to do is put in Indian. Unfortunately, we're also going to get articles from India. I don't know how many articles there are about teen pregnancy in India, but it doesn't matter. We can throw those out. So we need to come up with keywords. If you can come up with the proper keywords, you're going to be able to do some relatively good research. And it's relatively quick. The better your keywords are, the better your research is going to be. So if you can come up with the right keywords, this is a trick. Have you guys been in Sarah's class? Does she talk about keywords and how important they are to seeking information? Keywords. That's one of the reasons why, if you look at an article, right below the title, it will have the keywords that have gotten you to that point. And sometimes, if you look at those keywords, you can find one that you didn't think of, because there's always one you didn't think of. Anyway, okay, so we can type in there teen pregnancy, and we can also type in there American Indian, indigenous populations, or whatever. Because it might be interesting to find out if the teen pregnancy on the reservations is actually higher than it is on off the reservation. But the other problem we're going to get is that here we want to know about this reservation, and we may get information about all the reservations in the United States, and there are hundreds. Right? Okay, so we may get information about Pine Ridge, or Wind River, or Cheyenne River, or Fort Belknap, or Fort Peck, or Blackfeet, or Cheyenne, Northern Cheyenne, or Crow. You never know what you're going to get. Okay, so anyway, once we read all this information and find out if they have done the research that we're looking for, at that point, we can decide ourselves as to whether we want to do research. If there's already that information out there, all we need to do is take it from another source. But if it's not there, now we have to come up with a theory of teen pregnancy. So if you were looking at teen pregnancy, what would you think would be the factors causing teen pregnancy? What are some of the things that cause teen pregnancy?
Lack of education.
Alcohol. Alcohol? Okay, alcohol. We can punch that in and see what we get. Teen pregnancy, American Indian, and alcohol. And I'm betting you wouldn't get hardly anything at all. But that's a good one. Let's go ahead and stick with the alcohol, because that's going to be a variable in our own research. Any other factors? You said age before, Edison, right?
Well, I was thinking more on the lines of, it could be 2 different things. In reality, I guess the first portion would probably be based on the guidance of the parents
Okay,
direction and so forth. And then secondly would be probably falling back on the outer portions of things, meaning like schools and stuff like that relating to education, sex education particularly.
right, right. Now, we have to think in terms of how in the world are we going to do this research? How are we going to find out about alcohol? How are we going to find out about how good the parents are? Is that something that do we have a measurement that we can measure parental interaction? Yeah, you're right, not really. So this is going to be a tough one, isn't it? So we can't even talk about the parents, because otherwise we'll have to interview the parents, I guess. And we could do that. But of course, that's a qualitative research, and that's going to reduce the number of people that we can use in our research. So alcohol, well, how do we measure alcohol usage?
Age alcohol.
Could we ask people how many drinks they have a week? Could we measure alcohol that way?
Could we measure it by underage drinking?
Right, but we need specifics. So when we look at teen pregnancy, we're going to have to find out if this is really a factor affecting that teen pregnancy. So we can get underage drinking, but it may not be the same people. So I'm assuming what we're going to do is we're going to find a group of individuals. This is sad because we're only picking on the females, right? We are. We're only picking on the females. But we're going to ask them about all this information. Now, since we're not just going to talk to women, young girls that got pregnant, but we're also going to talk to young girls that didn't get pregnant, right? Because we need a control. Okay. So what are factors that would keep people from getting pregnant? What are some of the things some activities that they could do to keep them from getting pregnant?
Sex education?
Sex education. What kind of sex education do they have in the school? Okay. So we can use that as a variable. Everyone will have had sex education, but when do you get sex education?
Probably in health class or PE, one of the two.
Okay. What year is that?
Assume probably the early years into high school, so.
These are all old farts. Here we are. These guys are so old. When do you get sex education?
I got it in high school.
In high school?
Same.
So you don't get it until the 9th grade or 10th grade?
Yeah, ninth grade.
That's
Ninth
why I
grade.
said ninth grade.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, he does know. Right. Oh, you've got kids. What am I talking? Yeah, what am I talking about? Okay. Yeah. When I was in school back in 1965, yeah, we got it in health class in junior high school. We got it in junior high school. Well, that's another thing. Okay, so you get it in high school. This is going to be interesting because we need to find out if they had a baby before they got to high school. Okay, and that does happen. People do get pregnant before they get to high school. Okay, so is there anything else that will keep these individuals from getting pregnant? Any other factors that you can think of?
I think parents.
Yeah, parental
Well, the
involvement.
parents, but I don't know how we're going to measure that.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Edison was talking about the same thing, and I agree. I mean, parents are very important.
Like what do you say? Absence of parents and parents are usually around.
Yeah, but how do we measure that? I guess we could ask them, do you have both parents at home? Well, you know, we could do that. Single parents?
Single parents.
Are they more are children of single parents, are they more likely? Who is raising you, I guess? Are both parents in the home? I don't know how in the world we're going to ask that question. But of course, it's something that we need to ask if we're going to use that as a variable. I think you know, and now that we're talking about it, I think you guys are right. I think we need to find that out. How many parents are at home? Do you have both of your biological parents are at home? And that's a question we can ask. Do you have both biological parents in your home? Or we can ask, do you have two parents in your home? Oh, this is tough, isn't it? Because a lot of people are raised by their grandparents. And I guess another question we could ask is, are you being raised by your grandparent? Or who is raising you? If no, who is raising you? Wow. Yeah, because we need to find single parents. And we need to factor that into that. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes, sir.
No, I was just gonna say that a lot of that information is pretty much obtained when a child is being enrolled at a school within their application process. It states on there if both parents are there at home with the child.
Right.
And or if there's a secondary family.
Okay, here's the problem. Can we get to that information?
FERPA.
FERPA, exactly. FERPA,
Mhm.
thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So we don't have access to that information.
Exactly.
But we can ask them that information. If they agree, and actually, these are underage kids, so we're gonna have to get their parents to sign off and allow them to do this. This is getting ugly, isn't it? Yeah, this is getting interesting. Okay, so what we need to do, I thought of a couple other factors. One of them is how strong is their culture? If they have a strong culture, are they more likely or less likely to be teen parent, to get pregnant as teenagers?
Depending on the culture, because like as in that culture, they don't actually advocate for teen pregnancy, but they say start young so you can have more children.
Mm.
If you start old, it's going to be hard for you.
Right.
So,
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. And all babies are a blessing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Who
the
can-
more children you have, the more wealthy you are.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess culture wouldn't be a factor, would it? Or maybe it is a factor. Let's find out if it is. Let's use culture. I'm just curious. So let's use culture in this, if you don't mind. And let's see if the more cultural you are, whether there are more teen pregnancies. And of course, we're going to be doing the research right here on the reservation. This reservation, okay, we're not going up to Montana, talking to the crow, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay here. Okay, what's the other factor I was thinking? Sports, athletics. If somebody is an athlete, does it keep them from getting pregnant as a teen? So we're trying to find factors that help them stay away from teen pregnancy, and we're trying to find things that maybe potentially add to the teen pregnancy. So we're using all these other independent variables. We're going to talk about independent variables in a minute. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a theory. And we have to come up with a theory that utilizes we need to come up with hypotheses. So when we're talking about parents, maybe our hypothesis, what would our hypothesis be as far as parents and teen pregnancy is concerned?
What was the question?
We're talking about parents. What would our hypothesis be as far as teen pregnancy is concerned? Do we think that an intact family is less likely to have a daughter that has teen pregnancy, that gets pregnant as a teenager? I was just talking to somebody downstairs. I know, it just came out. I decided to talk about that in class this morning, or like 7 o'clock this morning.
I think it would be more dysfunctional homes.
The more dysfunctional home, the more likely the child will get pregnant early. Okay, so that's our hypothesis about that. How about our hypothesis about athletics, about sports?
I think that serves as a prevention.
Prevention, sure. So the hypothesis would be individuals that participate in athletics are less likely to get pregnant as a teenager. Okay, what's another factor that we came up with?
The culture.
The culture. Yeah, this is an interesting one because, as you say, they say start young, and the more children you have, the more wealthy you are, right? Okay, that's the idea. The culture. So, and I'm just curious about this as to whether it would actually increase. The more cultural you are, the more culturally perceptive you are, would it increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood? So I'm not exactly sure what the hypothesis would be at all. This could be curious. This is just something interesting that we're kind of throwing in. It's an independent variable that may not affect the results at all. So as we go through this, one of the things that and we're not talking about independent or dependent variables at all, but independent variables are variables that affect the dependent variable. And in this case, teen pregnancy is a dependent variable. And all those other factors, athletics, culture, parental structure, these are all independent variables. And we're trying to find out how they affect the dependent variable. So potentially they're manipulatable. Independent variables you can manipulate, but in this case, of course, we're not going to manipulate them at all. Okay. Basic research can be characterized as research that is not applicable, but advances scientific knowledge. Applied research increases the understanding and the solutions to real-world problems by using current knowledge. So would this be applied research, or would this be basic research? Is this applicable, or is this not applicable? Is this just a scientific experiment? Or is it applicable? It is applicable, because we're talking about something specific. And we are talking about a situation. Now the other question we have to ask, do we really want to reduce teen pregnancy? I mean, that is a question that we have to ask ourselves. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? In other cultures it may be considered bad, but in this culture it may be considered good. So teen pregnancy is not a bad thing. But we didn't say it was a bad thing, did we? We're just trying to find out factors that lead to teen pregnancy. From the theory, the scientist develops hypotheses, and that's what we were doing. If somebody is athletic, they're less likely, if somebody participates in athletics, they're less likely to get pregnant as a teen. That's a hypothesis. And we come up with a hypothesis for every variable. The parents are intact families less or more likely to have an individual in the family that gets pregnant as a teen. Hypotheses are testable propositions that describe a relationship that may exist between events. Hypotheses allow us to test a theory by suggesting how we might try to falsify it. One of the problems with research is that as a researcher, I have to try to prove my ideas wrong. And that's really difficult because scientists are the smartest people around. And here they are, they're arguing that their hypotheses are incorrect. And that's just backwards. So actually this is very difficult to do. So there's a lot of individuals that have a difficult time saying, I had this idea but it was wrong. Lots of people do. Almost nobody says, I've got this really good idea but I think it's stupid. You know, nobody does that. But that's what they have to do as a scientist. You have to try to prove yourself wrong. And that's tough. So usually what happens in research is that they will bend over backwards to make their ideas correct. And of course, that's not what they're supposed to do. As a scientist, you're supposed to try to prove yourself wrong. Hypotheses allow us to test a theory by suggesting how we might try to falsify it. Hypotheses give direction to the research. Because hypotheses are predictive, they tend to be also be more practical. So the hypotheses have to be applicable. And actually, in social psychology, you very rarely see basic research. Almost everything is applied research because it has to be applicable to the real world. Otherwise, why in the world are you doing it? Ethical concerns about the study must be addressed, including whether use of deception is justified. In this case, of course, we're not going to use deception, but in this case, we have to ask ourselves, can we ask these people these questions? Is it okay to ask a 14-year-old girl a question about, we're not asking any questions about her sex life. We're not talking about anything specific. We're asking her about her family. We're asking her about athletics. We're asking her about her culture. How strong is her culture? And of course, we're going to come up with our hypotheses, and we're going to come up with a way to test everything, maybe using a survey, maybe using a questionnaire. But we don't have to worry about whether it's ethical or not. Well, of course we do. We have to worry about whether it's ethical or not. But we have to take this before an institutional review board. And they will tell us how ethical it is. And they will tell us whether we need to change any of the questions. Or they may throw out some of the questions. They may find it too intrusive. We will demonstrate our research methods, our surveys. We'll show them our surveys. And if they approve it, then we can only do things the way that we said that we would do things. We can't change it at all. Any changes that we want to come up with, any new questions that we want to come up with, we have to present that to the Institutional Review Board. And Dr. Kine is actually in charge of the IRB here at this institution, here at Dene College. So there are people that will review our research and make sure that it's ethical. So we're not going to do research that isn't approved. It's approved by the college. Of course, we're going to do that research here on the reservation. So we not only have to go through the Dene College, IRB, but also the Navajo Nation. Yeah, they have an IRB as well. Actually, they've just put it together, mainly because we just put ours together, so they figured they better get on board as well. Anyway, so we don't really have to worry about ethics, except, of course, if you put together an unethical piece of research, then they'll reject it, and they won't allow you to do it. And that's the way it should be. Okay. But we're not asking them any intrusive questions, are we? We're asking them about their athletics, we're asking them about their family. It has to be signed, so it's an underage individual. The reality is that the national organization that oversees IRBs, there are select populations that you can't, that they want you to stay away from. And one of them is underage people, underage individuals. So you have to get special permission to do research with underage individuals. You also have to get special permission to do research on, I can't remember the term that they use, but American Indians are one of those groups. Also prisoners people in prisons are one of these special groups. They have to get special permission in order to do the research, and also you have to get permission from the tribe. Okay. So, institutional review boards. We already talked about independent variables. We put together a group of independent variables. And of course, our dependent variable in this case was teenage pregnancy. So what we're trying to do is we're looking for factors that lead to teenage pregnancy or to keep you from teenage pregnancy, as interesting as that might be. The experiment is not just a word for study, it has particular meaning. The experimenter manipulates independent variables. In this case, we're not manipulating our independent variables, we're using them to tell us things. They use random assignment to put people in groups or conditions. In this case, we're not doing that, we're not putting people in groups. What we're doing is we're going to be surveying a group of teenage girls. We're going to be surveying teenage girls. They measure dependent variables. We're going to ask all of them. Of course, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go to their parents and get their approval because they're underage. And so the parents are going to have to approve of them participating in the research. We're going to measure our dependent variable. We don't know how many teenage pregnancies we're dealing with, but we might go to a high school that has a relatively large number of teenage pregnancies. Now, the vast majority of people are not going to have gotten pregnant during their teenage years, during their school years. So most of the people that we survey are going to be negatives instead of positives. The positive, of course, are the people that did get pregnant as teenagers. Controls, we will try to control as many variables as possible. In this case, of course, we're just dealing with the variables that we've talked about up to this point. The groups are equivalent to this at the start of the experiment. That's if we have a control group and we have an experimental group. But of course, we're not doing that. The experience difference, they will experience different levels of the independent variable. And sometimes you can do that. If we're dealing with a medicine, then we may give different groups of individuals different levels of the medication to see when it starts working and when it doesn't work. They don't experiment any. They don't experience any other differences other than the variables that we're talking about, because everything else is controlled. So if the groups are different at the end of the study, it can only be because of the different levels of the independent variable. Of course, in our experiment, we're not going to be doing that. Maybe I should have used something else. Maybe it would have been easier to use something else. Internal validity refers to making sure that nothing else besides the independent variable can affect the dependent variable. And of course, when we're talking about teen pregnancy, we're talking about a lot of different variables, and we're not going to talk about all of them. But there's nothing that we could do to control those variables. I mean, there are a myriad of questions that we could ask, but most of them are intrusive questions, and we certainly don't want to use intrusive questions. They wouldn't allow us to do that anyway. What's your boyfriend's name? You know, something like that. Who did you get pregnant by? My goodness gracious, that's not a question you could ask anybody. This is accomplished by controlling all extraneous variables and by randomly assigning people to different experimental conditions. So internal validity has to do with how many variables you're controlling. The more variables you're controlling, the more internal validity you have. Internal validity is established by controlling all extraneous variables and by using random assignment to conditions, but of course we're doing a different type of experiment. Even with random assignment, there is a small probability that different characteristics of people are distributed differently across conditions. To guard against misinterpreting results, scientists calculate the probability level. We talk about p-levels. P-levels have to do with whether this could possibly happen by chance. And there is a statistical formula that you use to come up with a p-level. And your p-level should be very, very relatively low, 0.005. If you have a p-level that's 0.1, that's way too high. The probability is way too high. So we're looking for p-levels. We're trying to determine if there is a possibility that your experiment, the variables that you're seeing occurred by chance. Athletics. Could that happen by chance? What's the probability? No, what we're talking about is whether athletics are a tempering factor to teenage pregnancy. External validity is the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to other situations and other people. So we do this research in Chin-Li. Can we go to Kienta and say the same thing about the people in Kienta? No. Or Ganado, or St. Michael's. No, that's a Catholic school. That's different. So now we have to factor in Jesus. Gee, many persons. This gets tough sometimes. So external validity has to do with whether you can generalize this to another group. So we can't do it in Kienta. We can't generalize it to Ganado, but can we generalize it to the reservations in Montana? Are the indigenous peoples of Montana similar to the people on this reservation? No, we can't do that. Anyway, so the external validity is not going to be very high. But probably what's going to happen is that we have come up with this question because we seem to see a cluster of this problem here, and we need to find out what this problem is. Now, here's something kind of interesting. We can look at these factors, and what we might potentially be able to do is say, if we have a cluster of pregnancies in another school, say that one in Gallup, the one with the Japanese name. Yeah, whatever it is. If we see a cluster in that school, of course the population is different, but can we say this was a factor here? Could it possibly be a factor there? Maybe you should look at this. And we could do that. Potentially we could do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So we may be finding something that is generalizable. And actually, remember we're talking about the parental structure in the home. So single parents. And of course this seems to come up all the time that single parenthood, kids coming from single parent homes are more likely to get pregnant as teenagers. This is a statistic we've seen before. So if our research says exactly the same thing, and then we start seeing a cluster of pregnancies in the high school in Gallup, then we might say, well, look at this as a factor. Potentially this is true as a factor. Not only is this true all around the United States, but here is a school that we did research on that's very close to Gallup, and potentially that is a factor there as well. Mundane realism is the extent to which an experiment is similar to real-life situations. And of course, our experiment is dealing with real-life situations, so there will be mundane realism. Psychological realism is the extent to which the psychological process is triggered in an experiment or similar to psychological processes that occur in everyday life. Of course, we're not really looking at psychological factors. The only psychological factor we're really looking at is culture. So potentially what we could, well, I don't know what we're going to find out. Okay. Field experiments. Field versus lab experiments. Field experiments are more natural setting, which lead to easier generalization. Of course, that's what we're doing. We're actually doing a field experiment. We're going out to a school, and we're going to be questioning individuals. Less control leads to less assurance about cause and effect. Of course, we don't know what the cause and effect is. All we can say is this is either a factor or this is not a factor. Lab experiments are unnatural settings, and of course that limits the amount of generalizability. It's easier to control, leads to stronger causal claims. Virtual environment technology, early studies suggest a promising combination of realism and control. And this is the research that you guys are going to be looking at this semester, web-based studies. They recruit people off the internet. They can get millions of people if they can get people to go to that site. They run studies remotely, of course, so it's cheap and it's relatively easy. The non-representative samples, of course, this is the problem. The only people going to those sites are, we don't have a random sampling of individuals. What we have are college students. We have psych students primarily. I mean, who's going to go to the social site? Gee, dude, what do you want to do this Friday night? There's nothing to do. Let's go to the social psych site and do some surveys. That'll be fun. We'll see if we can find some that are really funny, that kind of stuff. That never happens. Only psych students do this kind of stuff, and they're all college students. But at least it's information. Implicit measures, reporting what people don't know that they think, what they don't know they think. Brain imaging techniques are another way that we can do these use these new technologies. Anyway, so let's talk about another experiment. So we put together our experiment. I'm betting that the stronger the culture, the less likely the individual is to be pregnant. Because what I'm thinking is culture leads to it comes from a strong family. And I think that's one of the reasons that teen pregnancy occurs. So you're not going to have a 13 or 14-year-old that's pregnant from a strong, intact family. So let's talk about another piece of research. This is research done by Dr. Belvedere. He observed that his female students complained about their boyfriends more than they did about their husbands. While at the same time, men complained about their wives, but rarely about their girlfriends. So we got opposites going on. Women are complaining about their boyfriends, men are complaining about their wives. But men don't complain about their girlfriends. And women don't complain about their husbands. This doesn't make any sense. Everything's backwards. Dr. Belvedere theorized that women treat men differently when they are dating than when they are married. This made women complain more about before their wedding and men complain more after their wedding. Belvedere hypothesized that women believe that if they marry a man, they will be able to change all of his faults. Really? Women believe that? This is a tragedy. He also hypothesized that men believe that if they marry their girlfriend, things will remain the same as they were when they were dating. So men don't want things to change, and women want everything to change. She wants to change him completely. She wants him to stop watching football on Sundays. And he thinks, wow, gee, she's really friendly. She's going to be friendly for the rest of our lives. She's going to be real friendly in the rest of our lives. Social psychology uses 4 approaches to research. Field research is done in natural, real-life settings outside the laboratory. Laboratory research is done in a laboratory, of course. Correlational research compares 2 or more variables, usually from a field study, and experimental research manipulates 1 or more variables in a controlled setting. Okay, so there's 4 different types of research, and we're going to talk about them right now. We're going to use Dr. Belvedere's study to talk about all 4 of these types of research. Dr. Belvedere decided to do a preliminary meta-analysis study on his hypothesis and found that studies from the 1950s and the 1960s showed that women during that era rarely complained about men. They couldn't find hardly any studies where women complained about men. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the studies showed increasing complaints about men. So what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Women's movement.
Women's movement, exactly. Before that, women kept their mouths shut because they had no power. But then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the women's movement started, and women started complaining about their men. Okay, that's all very logical. Belvedere decided to bring a group of subjects into the lab to give them a fictional scenario that the individuals would have to respond to. He discovered that men expected women to try to change them after marriage, and women felt compelled to try to change their men. So that's in the laboratory. So he's done a laboratory experiment, and he's discovered that his hypothesis is correct. The observational method involves systematic observation and measurement of behavior. Ethnography is a type of observational method used by cultural anthropologists and social psychologists to study and understand a group or culture. And of course, Dr. Kine and Dr. Ami teach a class using the ethnographic method. And it's fascinating. Dr. Ami is an anthropologist, and Dr. Kine, of course, is a research psychologist. So you're getting some of the best information you possibly can. The probability of you finding a class that teaches ethnography is fairly remote, because it's hard to find 2 individuals with such expertise who are collaborating and putting these things together. But you guys are really lucky that those 2 guys are teaching that class. And it's funny to listen to them talk about what they're going to do in class. Because Sarah's going to be late today. You guys have class today. Is anybody taking that class right now? Okay. It was funny because yesterday Sarah was going, well, I might be late for class, so I'll just let Christine, start class out. And Christine's going, no, I don't have anything. It's really kind of funny listening to them talk about what they're going to teach. It's really kind of interesting. They do a fabulous job. And the reality is it's going to be a rarity for you to find a class that is put together by 2 experts like that. So you're in rarefied company in that class. That is probably a class you'll never see again. Whether you get your master's degree or your PhD, you'll never see that again. So take in as much information as you possibly can. Even though Christine is kind of a hard to, she's kind of strict. That was nice. I was thinking of something else. She's tough. She's tough. I don't think I could take a class from her. And I study archaeology. Participant observation is a form of systematic observation whereby the observer interacts with the people being observed, but tries not to change the situation in any way. And we see this from time to time. We see participant observation. You're trying to figure out, you've got a hypothesis about Hell's Angels, so what do? You join Hell's Angels, of course, to get more and better observation, participant observation. So you become a Hell's Angel in essence, but you try not to come up with any ideas. You're not trying to change Hell's Angels, you're just trying to find out how they operate. So you join the gang. Belvedere's next step was to put together a field study approach. He hired 25 males and 25 females to keep a diary of their conversations over a 2-week period. They were not allowed to steer any conversation toward the topic. So it was people writing down other people's conversations. There were not enough episodes of people complaining about the opposite sex to make any determination, so Belvedere decided to allow people to bring the topic up in conversation. In other words, he manipulated the variable. So he decided that we're going to hire Francis here, and Francis is going to go over to Travis and say, man, my wife just gave me a hard time. How about your wife? How's your wife? What's going on with that? Okay. Way to go. He's going to punch you in the nose if you're not careful. Interjudge reliability, the level of agreement between two or more people who independently observe and code a set of data. Now the reality is that we have, all of these individuals have become judges, and they're going to have to write all this stuff down. But what are they going to write down? Are they going to tape the conversation? No, they're going to have to decide what they're going to listen to. So me listening to a conversation and Francis listening to a conversation, he may hear it completely differently than I did. And that is known as interjudge reliability. Are we on the same page? Are we listening for the same things? Are we listening for the same keywords? And that has to do with interjudge reliability. Archival analysis is a form of observational method whereby the researcher examines the accumulated documents of a culture. They look at documented information from the past. And of course, this is part of what Dr. Ami and Dr. Kine are talking about. Archival analysis. So can you go into the archives and get information? Well, sure, but it all depends on who wrote it down. What were they thinking? If I made a mistake and I'm talking about something that I did and I made a mistake, I'll probably try to gloss it over, won't I? Yes, I will. Of course I will. I'm not going to get fired just because I did something wrong. I'm going to try to blame Francis, of course. When researchers decide to do research, they determine a population that they're going to perform the research on. So in Belvedere's case, he's talking about men and women potentially at the college. When we were talking about our research, we decided our population was teenage girls, right? Teenage pregnancy, because that's what we're talking about. So that's our population. Not just teenage girls, but indigenous teenage girls. The population could be as large as the world population or the people taking social psychology at Ashford. That should be, say, Dene College, of course. That's when I was teaching at Ashford. And I didn't change that because I didn't see it this morning. I just bounced right over it. A random sample is a survey procedure where every person in the population being studied has an equal chance of inclusion. By only allowing a college or prison population to be surveyed, a researcher is creating an unrepresentative sample. And of course, we talk about representative samples all the time. So if we just do the girls in Chinle, Is that a representative sample? Well, it's a representative sample of the people in Chinle, probably, but it doesn't really take in more rural areas like Lukchukai or Pienta or mini farms or whatever, mini farms or wheat fields or whatever. I don't know. There's no school out of wheat fields, is there? I don't drive around very much, okay? I've been through Ganado. That was kind of interesting. That you go around that circle, that's a little weird. Right out in the middle of nowhere, they've got this thing where you have to drive around. Meta-analysis examines the outcomes of many studies. How am I doing? Okay. Meta-analysis is a statistical technique used to combine information from many empirical studies on a single topic to objectively estimate the reliability and overall size of the effect. Meta-analysis. Meta-analytic researchers strive to include non-published studies to avoid the file drawer effect. One of the problems we have in research is if so you come up with a hypothesis and you test your hypothesis. What if your hypothesis is wrong? What do you do with that research?
Research it again, contest it,
Okay, so do we publish?
more likely
Not, no, of course not. It's going to make us look stupid. I have this idea, turned out to be completely wrong, but I decided not to publish because it made me look as dumb as I really am. You know, that's not going to happen. People don't publish things that look stupid. So and this is called the file drawer effect. So we don't know what other people have done because they haven't published. Other people may have come up with the same idea you did, but they didn't publish it because it may not be true. And this is known as the file drawer effect. So the problem is that people only publish positive results. They don't publish negative results. Real serious problem. The other problem is that if you do research and it turns out wrong, or it turns out that your hypothesis is completely incorrect, it's hard to get a journal to publish it. You know, I had this idea and it turned out to be wrong, man. You know, who's going to publish that? Usually they will only publish if there's something positive in the research. So this is a real serious problem. I mean, we have scientists all over the United States doing all kinds of research, and some of it's turning out negative, and we're never finding that out. So people keep doing the same thing over and over and over again because nobody tells them that it's wrong, even though they've already done the research. And this is known as a file drawer effect. So they just shove it into the file drawer. Since findings from a single study are less convincing than findings from a series of studies, a meta-analysis can provide a clear statement of the state of research on a topic. I think I've told you about my research. One of the things I was testing for resilience, and one of the things I found was that the level of trauma with all the populations that they do resilience research with, in most cases, if the trauma increases, the resilience goes down. So there's a negative correlation between trauma and resilience. That's logical, right? However, they have done resilience research on American Indian reservations. And one of the things that in 2 studies they discovered that as the trauma increased, the resilience didn't decrease. I know, it sounds like a negative, doesn't it? So what they discovered was that trauma didn't affect resilience. And when I did my research, that's what I found out too. In that population, I measured the trauma, I measured the resilience level, and the resilience level did not go down as the trauma increased. I know. One of the pieces of research was done here on this reservation by the guy that's coming next week. No, 26th. White. He did research where that's what he discovered. That as the trauma increased, the resilience didn't decrease. That's not similar to any place else in the United States, except the Tohono O'odham Reservation. They found exactly the same thing. And I found the same thing up in Montana with that native population. I know. This is kind of interesting, isn't it? Yeah, okay, so if I had just found that out, maybe that would be anecdotal. Maybe that wouldn't be important. But since we've found it in 3 different indigenous populations, maybe that is a point of fact. Maybe that is generalizable. Doing a meta-analysis and looking at all the other research that has been done, it is possible that that is true of American Indians. It's not true of Hispanics, it's not true of African Americans, it's not true of European Americans, but it's true of this population. So as the trauma increases, the resilience does not decrease. And it's only true of this population. That's kind of exciting, if you think about it. I know. But I can't just say that by myself. If I find that I tested 103 people, I looked at 103 people, that may be anecdotal. It may just be a truism with the people from Fort Belknap. It may not be true with anybody else. But since it was the same thing was discovered in 2 other locations with 2 other populations, maybe that's actually true. So 1 person saying something doesn't mean a whole lot. 3 people saying something, that means a lot more. A researcher can prejudice his sample by using an underrepresentative sample. Other ways of prejudicing the results of the survey include order of questions, limited response options, question wording, demand characteristics, subtle cueing of the participants to answer in a desired way. Normally what we do in social psychology is that we standardize our surveys. And that's what I did. I didn't take the surveys, I didn't make up any surveys. I took surveys that had already been used on other populations. My resilience scale was a scale that had been used 20 or 30 times. And people had said that it was accurate. I used a cultural scale. And it was a scale that had been used, it was developed by a lady out in Los Angeles at UCLA. And she had standardized it using a native, African American, Hispanic, and what's the other population? No, that was it, yeah, Hispanic, white population, of course. But she had looked at all 4 of those cultures. And that's how she had standardized it. And it had been used 70 or 80 times as accurate. It had also been used on this reservation. Okay. So what I was dealing with, I didn't have to deal with any of this because all of my questions had been tested in other with other research. Okay. Participant observation is a subset of naturalistic observation. The researcher joins the group being studied as a participant. I was talking about Hell's Angels. A classic example of this type of research is the study of a doomsday cult by Leon Festinger and his colleagues in 1956. After infiltrating the cult, they joined the cult. Festinger and his colleagues chronicled the cognitive dissonance of the cult leader and followers when the world didn't end on the 21st of December in 1956. As exciting as that is. So he joined this doomsday cult, and they said that the world was going to end on the 21st of December 1956. What he wanted to find out was, after it didn't end on the 21st of December 1956, what in the world were they saying? And how were they rationalizing their cult? That's what he wanted to find out. And of course, Leon Festinger is the guy that came up with the concept of cognitive dissonance. Having 2 ideas in your mind at the same time. The idea that the world is going to end, but after the due date, after your expiration date, what are you thinking? And that's where Quinney came up with cognitive dissonance. One reason that laboratory research is so widely used in science is because variables can be controlled. In a laboratory, I can control everything. Remember Albert Bandura? He brought those kids into his laboratory, and he had them observe an adult beating up on toys, and then he let them into the room. And they did the same thing to the toys that the adult was doing. Remember that experiment, that famous experiment? Yeah, Albert Bandura. And from that, we assume that observational learning, you learn by observing. So we can learn violence by observing it in other people. Observational learning. Anyway, so he controlled all the other factors. He controlled all the factors in that research. He was able to do that. But how accurate is it, since we're talking about kids in a laboratory? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. The variable that is manipulated or controlled by the researcher is known as the independent variable, of course, and the one that is tested is the dependent variable. And he was looking for a couple different things. One, he was looking to see if the children acted like the adults. And he had two groups. One group where the adult acted violently toward the toys, and one that played with the toys nicely. And what he found out was the children that saw the adult being violent with the toys were more violent with the toys than the children that observed the adult playing nicely with the toys. So they did exactly what the adults did. And of course, that's observational learning. Doing research on people who are not aware what the experiment is about is not ethical. You have to tell them why you're testing them. And you have to tell them before. Remember the Milgram experiment. He took them in and he said that he was doing educational research. He wanted to find out if punishment was a good way of teaching people. So he had the guy electrocute the guy next door if he got a question wrong. Milgram. Milgram's experiment today would be unethical. We couldn't replicate his experiment. It would be impossible in today's society. In the United States. We could probably go to Romania and do it if we wanted to. Who wants to go to Romania and do research? I can't speak Romanian, for one thing. For an individual to participate, the researcher should first inform the subject about what and why the experiment is being done, and this is known as informed consent. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to tell the people that are participating why you're doing the research. And of course, we talked about teen pregnancy. We would have to tell the teenagers, we'd have to tell the parents, because they're the ones that would have to sign off on the research. We'd have to tell them that we are trying to discover factors that lead to teen pregnancy. That's what we'd have to tell them. And we would have to tell them what our independent variables were. We couldn't hide something from them. We couldn't test them for a cultural degree of culture without telling them that we thought that culture was a factor. We couldn't lie to them. You can't lie to them. Deception is misleading participants about the true purpose of a study. Debriefing is explaining to the participants at the end of the experiment the true purpose of the study. And actually that's what I did. So I tested all these individuals, and then I wrote up my research and I sent them a copy of it. I told them what I did and what I discovered. And that's known as debriefing. The correlational method involves systematically measuring the relationship between two or more variables. Okay. For example, how much one can be predicted from the other. And of course, that's a correlational method. The correlational coefficient is a statistic that assesses how well you can predict one variable from another. And this has always confused me. I've got a picture that will make everything seem like it makes sense. Correlational research assesses the direction and strength of the relationship between two variables. Correlational research is designed to examine the nature of the relationship between two or more variables, not controlled by the researcher. Correlations are used for prediction. If you know the value of one variable, you can predict the value of another. Correlational coefficient measures linear relationships between two variables. It ranges from +1 to -1. Strength is indicated by magnitude, absolute value. Direction is indicated by the plus or minus sign. Okay, so that's how we write it, but this is really what it looks like. What we have to do is we have to we have to create a scatter plot. Now remember I told you that degree of trauma didn't affect resilience, and that was a surprise. So since it didn't affect the resilience, this is what it looked like. It was all over the place. My results were all over the place as far as trauma and resilience were concerned. So what you do when you do an experiment and you compare two variables, you create a scatter plot. And if the scatter plot moves in a positive direction, then there's a positive reaction between one variable and the other. So in my research, I was looking at culture, and I was looking at resilience level. And there was only one factor that was positive, and that was culture and resilience. The stronger the culture, the stronger the resilience of the individual. So this is what I saw. I saw a positive result. And so when I did the scatter plot, that's what I discovered. When I looked at education and resilience, what I discovered was this. There's no correlation between the two. I thought maybe that women were more resilient than men. But when I looked at the correlation between resilience and gender, this is what I discovered. Nothing. So I talked about age. I thought that maybe older people were more resilient than younger people. And when I looked at that factor, this is what I discovered. There was no correlation between the two. So when you put two variables together, what you're doing is you're creating a scatter plot, and you're looking for something specific. You're looking for a specific direction. And as you can see, these are scattered in a positive direction. The more one thing happens, the more the other thing potentially happens. However, sometimes you have a variable that affects it negatively. So the more one thing happens, the less the other thing happens. Maybe we're talking about teen pregnancy and participating in athletics. There would be a negative correlation between teen pregnancy and participating in athletics. The more you participate in athletics, the less teen pregnancy you're going to see. And this is what it would look like. It's a negative correlation. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, good. I know, this stuff confuses the hell out of me. I hate this stuff. So if I can understand it, I hope you guys can understand what I'm talking about. And I don't know how Sarah and Dr. Wolf teach this stuff, but I don't know. This helps me understand what's going on. Correlations at or near zero may mean no relationship between the variables or a curvilinear relationship. Social science correlations rarely exceed 0.60 because most behavior is influenced by many variables. So whether I go out and get drunk on Friday night, there are a lot of different variables. You may think that everybody goes out and gets drunk on Friday night, you know, let loose. But you know, there are a lot of different variables that affect it. I didn't have a ride. We live on a dry reservation. I vomit every time I drink. Well, just tons and tons of different variables. My wife doesn't like it when I drink, actually. She's never seen me drink, so. But that might be a variable as well. There was a basketball game that night, so I went to the basketball game instead of going out to the bar and getting drunk. Tons and tons of different variables. So social science is really difficult to pin two things down because there are so many variables affecting what's going on. There's no gas in my car. I don't get paid until next Thursday. Lots of different reasons. When two variables are correlated, there is a natural tendency to assume one causes the other. However, there are problems in assuming a cause. Third variable problem, it is very difficult to isolate only two variables. So as we were talking about going out and getting drunk on Friday night, we were thinking, what are the variables? I want to drink, so I go out and get drunk. But there are so many other variables. Whether I have gasoline in my car, whether there's a basketball game on Friday night, whether my wife is giving me a hard time or not. I can use that as an excuse to go out and get drunk. So as you can see, there are just tons and tons of different variables. So there is no causation. It's really difficult to determine what causation is. Reverse causality problem, which variable is the cause and which is the effect. And this is a problem. If I go out and get drunk every time my wife gives me a hard time, is the getting drunk a cause or an effect? Do I pick a fight with my wife so that she will fight with me so that I can go out and get drunk? Which is the cause and which is the effect? That's the question. I don't drink, so this isn't really a realistic situation. Correlational method identifies only whether two variables are associated and not why they are related. And this is really not a problem. You need to start thinking in these terms. Cause and effect. Because there is no, you can't prove either one. You just know that two things are related. So we know that fighting with my wife is related to going out and getting drunk. We know those two are related, but we don't know which is causing which. Because all good alcoholics are really good at causing situations where they have an excuse to go out and get drunk. It's the way the world works. The correlational method often relies on surveys as well as on observational data. Surveys are used when the variable of interest is not easily observable, and I'm getting close. Surveys are structured sets of questions used to measure attitudes, beliefs, values, or behavioral tendencies. I used 3 surveys when I did my research. One measured trauma, one measured cultural level, and one measured resilience. And they were all set forms. It was really kind of interesting because I used a trauma measurement that had been used since the 1950s, but only in one piece of research. And I had to write a letter to the ladies that were doing that research back in the 1950s and ask them if I could use their research or their survey. And I finally got, she's like 105 years old. And so finally she writes me back and says, sure, go ahead and use it. Nobody else has ever used it. And the reality is it has been used, but it's a really old piece of, it's a really old survey. 4 major survey techniques are face-to-face, written, phone, and computer surveys. And of course the computer surveys are what you're going to be using in social psychology, in the social psychology website. Format, delivery system, and question phrasing are aspects of a survey that must be carefully considered. So you need to know if there's something wrong with them. If you've ever taken a survey from either the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee, those are very poor surveys, extremely poor. They're trying to guide you into how to answer the questions. Qualitative versus quantitative. Qualitative method investigates the why and the how of social science, not just what, where, or when. Hence, smaller but focused samples are more often used than larger samples. Qualitative methods are used in, you can only, interviews. You interview these individuals to find out if the information that you're looking for, qualitative. You can only interview a certain number of people, and usually your sample is much, much smaller. Quantitative, of course, you're putting numbers to things, you're doing surveys, so you can usually do it with a lot more people. All of the research that you're going to be looking at in social psychology, in the social psychology website, is quantitative. It's all quantitative. If a researcher could find an instrument that quantified a feeling or an idea or used a Likert scale, it is a quantitative research. And of course, my trauma research, my cultural research, and my resilience research all use the Likert scale. So this is my last, okay, we're not going to talk about that. Because of a lack of control of variables, it is difficult to impossible to determine cause. All you see is effect. Of course, there is a problem with observer bias. If somebody shoots at me, it scares me, and now all of a sudden my ideas about what's going on changes things completely, right? And that is observer bias. You have to be careful of your own bias. You also think you're smarter than everybody else. So that will give you a bias as well. Everything I think is correct. Okay, we need to stop right now. I'm not going to finish the rest of it. This is the end of the chapter, though. This is the second week, and I've just finished my second chapter, so I'm caught up. So tell all your friends. In other classes, they'll be so jealous that I'm actually caught up in your class and not caught up in theirs.